Sugar by Men I Trust is the flagship tune from their fourth studio release, the Untourable album. This record was made with the intention of breaking away from the limitations that come from planning to adapt songs into a live format. Throughout this record, they include new sounds that range from small details to large features that just weren't present on their previous release, Uncle Jazz. On the tune Sugar, that increased attention to detail finds its focus in the bass line. This track makes use of some interesting production techniques that we'll be breaking down, as well as going over how you can take those ideas and transfer them into your live playing. This is an analysis of the Uncle Jazz's bass line on Sugar.
It goes on and on and on, and it goes on and on and on.
This bass line makes use of three different voices for this main chorus-verse section. The first is the main bass line, which is picked and panned in the center with just a little bit of chorus. Then we have this slap part, which is panned to the left with some reverb. And finally, the synth, which is panned to the right. There's a few things going on here that we can really dive into. As you might have noticed, those parts technically overlap. In the second and fourth bars of the sequence, when our focus shifts towards the slap and synth bass parts, that main bass track is still holding out a note in the background. I think that this was the reason the bass player chose such different sounds for those ornamental bass parts. Had everything been played on just an electric bass with a pick, the sounds would have been too similar, causing it to sound like a muddy mess. But by using different timbres, there's no question of what we're meant to be focusing on. The verses are very similar to the intro chorus part, but with Jesse removing the slap part from the mix with a few semi-random exceptions. I love just how randomly that slap part is used here. It's so easy now with digital recording to fall into this habit of making sure everything has very neat and exact patterns. Sparsely adding in an element with seemingly no rhyme or reason as to why you did is super refreshing. In the bridge, we shift to a regular finger-style bass and synth bass, which are playing in unison. Right at the end there, the electric bass finally variates from the synth with this big movement up an octave. This variation somewhat transitions us back into the chorus, where we've come to expect that these different bass sounds are operating independently from one another. In the last chorus and the outro, the synth bass part changes. To get this sound, I'm playing very short notes with barely any sustain. The note length on these is so short that I'm honestly not 100% sure what the pitches are that he's playing. And honestly, it doesn't really matter. Just getting the general vibe is close enough here. Men I Trust have actually used this split bass technique before on their track Lauren. There, the bass line is split between two tracks in the chorus. Just like Sugar, we have the main bass line played with a pick and a separate slap part that has some added reverb. All of this overdubby stuff is super cool, but what if you were tasked with learning this tune for a gig? How would you go about adapting this part to play it in a live setting on just an electric bass? Well, the first obvious step here is to take that main part and cut it back so that it doesn't overlap with the slap and synth. For the slap part, there's a few options for how to adapt it. To just slap the note, you can pull that off pretty easily by just holding the pick like normal with your thumb and index finger, but popping the string with your middle or ring finger, whichever is the most comfortable. Now, this sounds cool, but I couldn't help but be reminded of a technique that Men I Trust have used before on their tune Tail Whip, where Jesse uses the pick to get a sound pretty similar to a normal slap bass pop. The popping sound in slap bass comes from the string physically slapping against the frets. Now, typically, this is achieved by taking the string, lifting it away from the fretboard, and releasing it. But that isn't the only way to do it. If you just pluck the string hard enough, it'll hit a fret and produce a very similar sound. Now, you can also do this with a pick, which is exactly what Jesse is doing on Tail Whip. Lifting that technique and placing it into Sugar sounds like this. Another thing I'm doing here is playing the same note on a different string to help give it a bit of a different sound. So I prefer the more full sounds for the picked part on the A string, but for that slapped note, I'm jumping over to a higher string where that note has a less full sound. Now, this is super nitpicky and certainly not necessary, but little details like this add a lot of depth to a part. Using the electric bass's quirks, like the same note sounding more thin on a higher string, is really helpful in gaining a deeper understanding of your instrument. I'm also playing the main synth bass part with a pick, which happens to match the attack of the synth sound in the original closer than just playing it with fingers. For the synth bass part in the outro, I'm playing it picked with a plucking hand's palm mute to give it that really short and sharp attack that the original synth has. Altogether, my adaptation of the part sounds like this. There's so much to learn from this track. What a great idea to use these different sounds to create ornamental or auxiliary bass parts. While it's somewhat common to hear a bass line make use of different sounds in different sections of a song, like changing to a synth bass for a bridge or palm muting a breakdown, I've never heard someone apply that idea on such a microscopic level. When I first listened to the track, I instantly recognized that there was a separate synth part, but it took me a while to realize that the slap part was also recorded separately, and actually overlaps with the main bass line. It's an extremely minor detail, but it's fascinating to see a recorded bass line be given as much precision in terms of production as vocals or guitar are often treated with. I also learned a lot from adapting this line into a place of live playability. Translating these different timbres by using different physical techniques opened my eyes to the kind of depth that you can approach a bass line with, even in a live setting. I've been playing this bass for over 2 years now, and I find myself constantly saying that it would be the perfect beginner bass if it was just more affordable. By presenting itself without any controls that can easily change the tone of the instrument, it really forces you to use your hands to get the sounds that you want. Applying that idea this thoroughly in a song was a great challenge and something that I really want to pursue further. So go and find a bass line that you really dig and try to split it into different parts or phrases. Then assign specific techniques to each of those parts and see how it sounds. You might just dig it. So that's my breakdown of the bass line on Midnight Trust's Sugar. If you're interested, I have a transcription of both the recorded bass line and my adaptation of it in sheet music or tabs linked right below that like button. I also recently put out a huge video on the making of Random Access Memories by Daft Punk. If that at all interests you, I highly recommend checking it out. This has been a Sugar bassline analysis. I'll be back soon with another video.